Okay, we are recording. Okay, so for this first question, the two that you left blank, it's usually fine to leave them blank as long as your answer is contained within the first one. So you did use bullet points, but you didn't take full advantage of that style. Like you're still using full sentences. They don't actually give you any additional marks for using full sentences. It might have been better if you just did like pros of merit-based, cons of merit-based, and then instead of saying like this whole the merit-based approach is useful, you could have just said like shows amount of time and start right from there. And then that's one way to save time just because you're typing fewer characters. Do you find that most of your time is wasted on trying to think of an answer or on like actually typing?
I'm actually typing.
Yeah, so if you're in the actually typing category, then like trying to reduce your word count would obviously speed you up. So you said this point here that it looks more closely at soft rather than hard skills, but then you also said that the merit-based approach is looking at extracurriculars. So usually extracurriculars are like soft skills, not hard skills, right? So that's a little bit of a contradiction as well. That might be a point for communication. And then here, so you basically said the two perspectives that were in the video, sort of like the two obvious perspectives, and then you sort of made a decision from there. And in the real world, when someone asks you a question, usually you try to just give them an answer. That's how most normal humans approach questions. And the CASPer is a little bit different from that. They don't really care what your decision is. It's mostly about your thought process. If you're limiting yourself to the two most obvious perspectives or the two perspectives that are in the video, they don't really get to see that much about your personality. So in this case, it would have been better to have, like, you don't need a final decision. You can just say, like, there's benefits of both, and then state what your benefits of both approaches are. And then if you don't even make a final decision, like, that's fine. The fact that you've stated pros for both approaches, it implies that your final decision would be some kind of compromise. And you would definitely get more points that way rather than spending time on writing what your decision is. So if you're at like two perspectives and you're at the point where you can either make a decision or add more perspectives, you should add more perspectives. But if you already have like 5 perspectives down and you can add a 6th, or you can write the decision, at that point is when you would write the decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah, on the actual test, will it tell you, like, will you get a timer for the 5 minutes?
Yeah, you will. This test is just like that because we don't have a budget. So Google Forms is the only free thing that I was aware of. But yeah, in the real test, you would have a 5-minute countdown. Do you want to take a stab at the second question while we're here?
Sure. Let me just review. So I think it's important to be non-judgmental in your approach. I would say that she's obviously worked very hard with her merit-based approach, and that may still be useful. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so there's like different perspectives for approaching this question as well. One perspective is to be like, okay, I'm a friend, so what's my role as a friend? In general, if you're ever stuck on a question and you're like, what can I do? There's different ways to approach it. The one I use is just think about what your role is. So you're a friend, and the role of a friend is like offering emotional support. So then something like empathizing with her and recognizing how stressful this whole process can be, that's definitely something useful to do. Or like being an active listener, letting her know that you hear her, and then also letting her know like more about why the universities are doing it this way. And also the video is like misguiding you a little. Like there is no program where it's 100% completely disregarding the merit-based approach. So you could even advise her to like look into it more and make sure that the thing that she's frustrated about is real, because it might not be. So questioning the question, as I refer to it. A lot of the questions make some kind of assumption, and questioning the question means seeing if that assumption is actually true and doing an investigation. And sometimes it's more important than other times. Like in this question, it's not that important, but other times it'll become more relevant. Like when we get to the research conference question, the assumption made is that you can only do one. But you can question that. You can say, what if I can attend the conference on Zoom and then attend the funeral in person, or something like that. And then the other thing you said about being non-judgmental. Non-judgmental is a good word to use because like it shows what your approach to be, but it's always more important to actually describe your approach than to use a word. And non-judgmental is a really long word. It might take you a while to like fully type it out. So if instead of saying like I would be non-judgmental, you wanted to specifically say like, oh, specifically, I would try to relate to what she said, explain how I felt when I was in the position of having to apply, being an active listener, using like open-ended questions and like repeating what she said to make it clear that I really understand what she's thinking. Right, what the CASPer is really looking for is for people who are faking good, and that's like a quote that's on their website. They use the words faking good. And what that means is that rather than actually trying to say what you would do, you try to put out down an answer that you think they want. So an example of that is using adjectives rather than specifically saying what you would do. The adjectives are useful for in your own mind. Like in your own mind, you know that your approach should be non-judgmental. And then when you actually go to type it, you can include the word, but you should also include like exactly specifically what you would do. Does all that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Would you recommend reading all the questions before starting to answer, or doing one question at a time?
I recommend going one question at a time, because if you answer one already and it's like contained in here, they don't dock you any marks for that as long as it's clear that it's in here. Like for this one, I don't think you really answered the second question within here. It's not as clear. But if you also like had a thing in here, like I would also say to my friend that blah, 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 then that's clearly a response to your friend. So then you don't need to waste time answering this one. So it takes time to read them beforehand versus if you just like go one at a time, and then if you happen to answer it, then just leave it blank. It'll start like as you do more practice, you'll start to be able to like predict what the future questions are. So it'll become more common that you even answer it without reading it.
Thank you.
Okay, what about for the third question? Like, did you want to try answering the third question?
Sure. So I kind of hinted at it in my answer, but I don't think I went into enough details. I said the differences in socioeconomic status result in unequal opportunity. Valuing soft skills is important, as often these cannot be taught, and hard skills can be learned while learning the profession. And then I ended up recommending merit-based with considerations for life circumstance.
Okay, so the one perspective is like be more equitable for life circumstances. That's one thing. Another way you could do it is again coming back to that role. So in this case, you want to look at what is the role for a university. So this question is sort of guiding you toward one role of a university, which is to be fair to its applicants. But if I asked you like, what's the primary purpose of a medical school? I highly doubt you would say, oh, to provide a fair admission process. Your first answer would probably be something like to create quality doctors or something along those lines. So that's something that can come up in your answer as well. Whichever one is most in line with the school's goal of producing quality professionals, that's the one that should be based. So if you think a merit-based approach produces better doctors, then that's an argument you could make. But there's also actually an argument that the merit-based approach doesn't correlate with how physicians actually perform. So if that's something you include in your answer, like anytime where you see something is related to current events and you mention it, definitely go ahead and do that. It'll make you stand out and it'll make it clear that you have a really well thought out answer. It's like going one step beyond. So in this case, you could, I don't know if you know this already, but just as an example, First Nations patients have the best health outcome when their doctor is also First Nations. Same thing with Black people. They have the best outcomes when their doctor is also Black. And it's like that in any marginalized community. When there's that patient-physician match, it's just better health outcomes for the patient. So if that's the case, then an important consideration for a medical school would be to have a graduating class that proportionally matches the population so that everyone has a chance to like get a doctor that matches to them, so to speak. So one benefit of alternatives to merit-based admissions is that it increases diversity, which is important for patient health. And then another important thing is when you're in actual medical school, half of your learning comes from your classmates. Like maybe it's just because I'm from McMaster and then we have the like group-based self-directed learning, but I'm sure it's like that at all schools where you're learning so much from your classmates. And if all of your classmates are your like stereotypical med student who's like privileged, coming from a certain background and socioeconomic status, it's actually a worse learning outcome for the student, like for each student, versus if you have a really diverse class and everyone has new perspectives to offer, then you can say interesting points and learn more stuff from each other, if that makes sense.
Should I be trying to relate this back to medicine in each case or just specifically for this one?
Just whatever direction your mind goes in. If you can relate it to medicine, that's good. If you have another perspective that you can relate it to, you can also relate it to that. It doesn't necessarily have to be medicine. It's just like for most people, since you are like pre-med, medicine is the thing you spend your time thinking about. So that'll probably be the easiest one for you. But if you have another perspective that occurs to you first, then there's no harm in including that.
Thank you.
Okay, so we can move on to the second one. Yeah, this one's a much stronger answer because you've really gone beyond the video. Having the additional perspectives that you don't have that aren't mentioned in the video, like the CASPer isn't a test of comprehension. They assume that you were able to comprehend the video. Like that's kind of what CARS is about, right? I think the P in CASPer stands for personality. So here, when you show that you are able to understand like the perspective of your friend versus the perspective of the conference, that's really important as well. Oh, and you mentioned the support in a virtual capacity. So that's a really good point as well. And then having an additional event too. Yeah, pretty good answer. Additional thing that you could mention is how much your absence from the conference matters. Like if you've discovered the cure to cancer and you have to present it at this conference, otherwise the cure to cancer is going to be delayed, then maybe you would go to the conference over the funeral. Versus if you are like in a team of 10 people and if you don't go to the conference, then your 9 team members would find it really easy to cover for you, then maybe you would prioritize the funeral instead. So in terms of, oh, actually you did say that, other friends or relatives that could, oh, like the opposite of that, basically, like the same point, but for the conference. Yeah, so almost that. It's good though, like you have 4 perspectives, that's usually enough. I'm just saying additional perspectives for the benefit of people watching this video. For in general, when you're writing a list of perspectives, it can be really beneficial to have a list of stuff that you always talk about. So for example, questioning the question like you did here, like offering to support your friend in an additional way, the video makes it seem like you can only support your friend by attending the funeral. But questioning that assumption and saying you can also support your friend virtually, that's a good point. So if you're not sure what to say, you can ask yourself, what assumptions are there in this question? And how can I question the assumptions? So that's a good way to go about it. Another thing is like the larger impact beyond what is currently there. So you sort of started on that with this, like the impact on your future careers and the impact on your friend, but also going above there and being like, what's the impact on the entire research community? So one way you could do that is to ask yourself, what would happen if everyone made the decision that I did? What would society look like if people all made this decision versus if they all made the other decision? And then that's an additional perspective that you could write about. For the second one, it's a good start to acknowledge that families can come in different shapes and sizes. But for the second part, it's a very limited if-then answer, right? Because that's not the only thing that would depend on if you would choose the conference. Like, what if the conference was like there were 3 times that it could be held, and then you can go on the third date and also be able to go visit Sarah as well? So in that case, even though there is other people who can support Sarah, maybe you would still also go. So phrasing it this way kind of negates all the hard work that you had up here with considering all these different factors. So instead, you could just say, I would not change my answer and would consider the factors in part 1. And that's actually fewer words as well. Did you want to try answering the third question as well?
Yeah, okay. Let's see. So you could mention the pros and cons. So checking in with your friend is important throughout the period you're at the conference if that's what you choose to do. However, that takes time away from the conference itself. So putting yourself in a situation where you're doing 2 things at once may not be the best, versus choosing one over the other can have negative consequences as well, such as your friend not getting the support they need, or you're not contributing towards the conference as you should be, which can have professional impacts. So in that case, I would choose a little bit of both. And I'd go with a time management. Are you allowed to include like an example of things you've done?
Yeah, that's kind of what this question is asking about more. Like all the stuff that you said would be good to include under question 1. Like those are factors that you can consider if you can multitask or not. But this one is basically asking you, what are your time management strategies? It's even going beyond this question. So they're definitely going to ask you about time management at some point, but every time they ask you, like the third question will often be a broader one that goes beyond that specific question. And when that happens, you can definitely include a personal example that you have. So an example of a strategy is to like make sure that both are equally prioritized. The reason that they're really asking these questions and why they prioritize time management questions so much is because of the huge problem that we have with physician burnout. So if you show that you're aware of that type of thing in current events and you mention its importance, that's another way where you really stand out. So you could say something like, it's important to prioritize mental health to prevent burnout, and it's definitely not good to prioritize personal or over professional or professional over personal. You have to kind of be able to balance both. Otherwise, there are going to be consequences one way or the other. So then you would mention like specific strategies that you would do in order to ensure that. So you could say like, I block in my personal time the same way I do professional activities. So whatever you do in your personal time to de-stress, whether it's doing a workout, whether you keep a journal, whether you meditate, whatever it is you do, like exactly what you do doesn't matter. it's more important that you have some kind of specific strategy and that this is something that like matters to you. I'm sure that you do have some kind of like de-stressing strategy or like mental health promoting activity. Everybody has that type of thing. There's no way you've made it this far in your career and you've never like had to think of a time management strategy. Do you like kind of get what this question is getting at?
Yeah, so you can draw off personal experience here a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. Just to make it more personal, because no two people are going to use the exact same strategies, right? And then when you mention something that you really do, it makes it seem more authentic. And again, it's helping you move away from looking like you're faking good. If you just put, even if it's a simple strategy, like one thing I do is when I'm doing my Anki, I go out for a walk. So they might not know what Anki is. So you could just say like, I do my flashcards while I'm outside. Then that's something that you could do as well, like combining both of them. If you have something that specifically you do, even if it's not some like complicated or revolutionary thing, it makes it seem a lot more realistic. Okay, let's try the third one.
I ran out of time with this one as well.
So that in this one, you really did answer all three questions in the same part. Did you like read the questions before answering?
So I started answering the first, realized I was running out of time, and then quickly looked at the second to see how I could try and get an answer in.
Okay. So these are really good points as well. Sorry, where did you put it? The most important factor is making sure that the friend has enough money to support themselves. That's like the key point for this question. So one of the red flags in CASPer is lacking empathy for a vulnerable party. And the trick is that sometimes it's hard to recognize a vulnerable party. Like in this case, Taylor is presented as this person who's just like abusing her friends because of issues that she has in her personal life. And I've seen a lot of answers where they're just like, either Taylor returns the money or I report her directly to the police. And phrasing it from this perspective of like, you're trying to support the friend is so important. I would even spend more time on that. So you could say like not only money, but the root cause is that her parents have cut her off because of her grades, right? So if you say that, like if you're her friend, then it makes a lot of sense for you to say that, okay, I would teach her how to study. I would help her like learn better study strategies, or if her problem is time management, then I would either help her myself, or if I like don't have time, then you can always direct her to campus resources. Most universities have like specific lessons on how to study, how to manage your time, and like general academic skills. And showing that you can take advantage of resources is an important point for CASPer as well. So it's definitely good that you included this. And this here being specific as well, like using non-accusatory statements doesn't mean anything, but then when you qualify it with I statements, then you explain what a non-accusatory statement is. So it's like, that's what I'm talking about when I say you want to have something specific. Again, that's something that you could expand more on. So you can even combine these 2 points. Another way you could be non-accusatory is to start off by saying like, Taylor, I remember you mentioned to me that you were doing poorly in class. Is there any way that I can help you? Like if you're somebody who has good grades, then definitely it's within your role as a friend to offer to help your friends who aren't doing as strongly. I'm not sure what this point means. Taylor becoming offended is not as important as the loss of money. Like the loss of your money is not as important as Taylor. Like, can you rephrase what this means?
Yeah, I think I was getting at like Taylor becoming offended isn't as important as the fact that the friend might not be as financially secure now.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is that you should still approach her, and the risk of her being offended is not outweighed by like the other negative circumstances that she has.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point to make as well. I would just separate those two things out. Like, again, it's more important to have perspectives than to have a decision. So if you split it into like pros of confronting, cons of confronting, and then under cons you could put Taylor being offended, and under pros you could be like dealing with the root issue, dealing with the impact on your friend's financial security, it would be a lot stronger and clearer, and you probably wouldn't lose any communication marks, versus here they might not understand what you're trying to get at. Like, you don't have to say like one is more important than the other, because it depends on so many things. And if you say that like personal safety is always more important, you can't like say that it's always more important. It depends on so many things. And when you have it split up so that there are different factors, it's kind of implied that like you would take the sum of all these factors and make a decision based on everything that you've stated. Like, why else are you listing all the factors if you're not going to consider them in your decision? I think it's pretty clear that like you don't have to write all the if then. You can just uh, go from there. Like, does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So I should, just to summarize, I should be doing more of a pros and cons list, like you mentioned for question 1, and avoiding the if-then sentences, because my pros and cons list should speak for itself.
Yeah, exactly. The if then is more like if you don't want to do a point form list. I don't know why anyone would choose to not have a bullet point list, but if it's like truly ruining your life, then like that's when an if then can be appropriate as well. But it just takes longer to type it out if you do it in the if then form than the bullet point form. And there's no marks for like grammar or anything, but there are marks for being able to state additional perspectives. If you go on the CASPer.com, and they have an FAQ section, and then what they have there is why did some people do better than other people on CASPer or something like that. And one of the things under their list of why some people do better is empathy. And the CASPer's definition of empathy is actually considering all perspectives. So that's probably not the definition of empathy that most of us have. It's probably something about like being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, something along those lines. But the CASPer has defined empathy as having, like, being able to consider all perspectives. So that's why it's so important to be able to list as many perspectives as you can compared to making a decision at the end of it. And then being able to actually make a decision is not in their list of why some people do better. They do have communication in there, but bad communication is something like you write a sentence and no one can tell what you meant. Or what some people do is they don't know what to say, so they just like say the same thing 50 times. So like, for example, your first point, accusing Taylor of money could result in its return. And then the second point, they would say like, your priority should be getting the money back. And then the third point, they could say like, the biggest issue is that your money is missing. So all three of those are actually the same point. And the fact that you've tried to disguise them as three different points will lose you communication marks. But that's not something that you've done. Like, I think you're generally fine for communication. Okay, let's try this one. Okay, so first, I think you try to apply the STAR method, and STAR is usually a really good way of going about it. So for the purpose of the people watching this video, STAR is situation, task, analysis, and result. And then you've even gone beyond that and done the like star L, and the L is like what you learned or like what you would change in the future. You did mention that at the end. And a lot of people get really confused about how to apply STAR, and they spend a long time explaining what they would do. So they focus too much on the situation slash task. I had a student where, for this exact question, they spent the entire time describing their research project and they got down to the nitty gritty scientific details. And it was honestly a really cool read, but the CASPer is not the place to flex your science knowledge. So here you have like two sentences about what the situation is. And honestly, that's all you need. Like, I can fully understand this situation with just these two sentences. So that's great. And then honestly, this is a really strong answer. Like, you didn't waste time on stuff that doesn't matter, and you had a good lesson as well. It's really important to have a lesson because they don't want a person where stuff just happens to them. If you have a lesson, then you show that you're someone who can learn from your experiences, and every time something happens, you grow from it, and you're affected by what happens to you, and you're an active agent in your own life, and that's so important for the CASPer. And the other good thing about this question is that it's a experience that kind of shows about who you are. So you didn't explicitly say what your role was. I guess that's one thing. If I was going to be nitpicky, you could add that you were a volunteer in this setting. I assume you were a volunteer.
Oh, yes, sorry.
It might also be better to this is even more nitpicky, but when you just say like Africa in general, it kind of perpetuates stereotypes that Africa is this underdeveloped area. So if you wanted to say like I was building water holders in a region that needed them, that would be better. Like, that's super nitpicky at this point, not that important. And then also to mention that you were a volunteer, because then that shows what you're passionate about. You're passionate about like global equality, and that's something that's really cool and definitely worth mentioning in the CASPer. So it's a good experience and it's applied well. I've seen lots of students use like something from school. Like, they'll say, oh, what I regretted was I failed a test in first year. Like, that's not as, if that's truly the only thing in your life that you've regretted, then like, what have you been doing with your life? Have you really been not doing anything other than academics? It just seems unlikely that there's nothing that you regret in your life other than poor school performance, versus like something here. This is a lot more powerful than that academic example. And the other thing to steer clear of is like the med school application cycle. Like, I've seen people who regret, their biggest regret is their poor MMI performance last year. Like, I literally had someone give me an answer where it was, I did poorly in my MMI last year, and my regret is now I have to do this whole application cycle again. And like, it was just phrased very poorly. It's hard to phrase it correctly when your regret has something to do with the med school application cycle or if it has something to do with academics. And something from your extracurriculars is a lot stronger. And then for this one, since you addressed the lesson and what you would do differently, oh, and you even specifically said, yeah, so there would be 0 marks lost for not having an answer here. It's 100% clear that it's up here. So that's a really good example of when it's okay to leave a question blank. And then for the third one, I really like how you have multiple perspectives here. It's all really good. One point is that, like, this question is sort of a trap. It's asking you, why do you think people pass up opportunities? And if you answer the question the way it's phrased, you end up making generalizations about people. So a way that's stronger is to say, like, one reason that I have passed up opportunity is because I have been afraid of failure. I've been afraid of like going outside my comfort zone and so on. And then when you phrase it as you have that additional opportunity to mention like, but since then I have realized that whatever, and I've learned this really powerful lesson. So it would have been stronger if you phrased it as I instead of people. But the fact that you had like multiple points down is already going to put you above average. Honestly, I think this was a really strong question. I think this is your strongest one so far. Yeah, so for this question, just changing it to be more personal in the last one, and then here, like staying away from Africa and mentioning that you were a volunteer is the only thing. Okay, station 5. You're better at these personal questions, eh? Like I can see you've already written so much here.
Yeah, I think I stopped like paying attention to my grammar and stuff when I realized I was running out of time too.
Yeah, they don't mark for grammar, so. So the second half of this is a lot stronger than the first half. You kind of got too much into detail with the specific science here. Like just say like I was doing a procedure in a lab and I did the procedure wrong. And that'll be because anyone can mark this. They might not have a science background. So they might like not even know like what it means that your gel didn't have DNA or what qPCR is. Like literally anybody could mark these. So staying away from assuming that they have a science background is generally a good thing to do. And also like it doesn't really matter if like your issue is with DNA or if it was with like anything else in a lab. The point is that you messed up the protocol and then at first you panicked, but then you realized that there's like this specific strategy important to consider time and cost. So that would be better to do as well. The other thing with this one is that you haven't mentioned in what context you were doing the DNA amplification. So it's going to be assumed that it was as part of your schoolwork. Since I know you, I know it's not from the schoolwork, but it would have been better if you had like mentioned like in my internship or like whatever work experience, just for them to show that like you're someone beyond your academics, right? You could even like say it even more briefly. You could say like as part of a research project, something like that, just to show that like it's not from school and you do exist outside of the academic setting.
So you should always pick like an extracurricular over like an academic if you can.
Yeah, you should only use academics in an absolute emergency. Like if you have spent too long thinking about it and you can't think of anything, it's better to get something about academics down than to leave the question blank. But ideally, you would spend time thinking about situations in advance, and that way you don't have to like be stuck in that trap. So if you go to takecasper.com and you scroll down, like literally on the homepage, there are these 10 skills. It's like communication, collaboration, resilience, self-awareness, motivation. Like I can't remember the whole list, but if you can have one situation for each of those 10 skills, you're never going to be stuck in a point where you don't have a situation prepared. Like you're going to be able to just reuse one of those 10 situations and apply it to the problem. And then you also aren't wasting any time thinking about it, right? Compared to your competition who might not have prepared as much. If you already have a situation ready, you spend more time typing, explaining, showing how you learned a lesson, and like you're someone who's an active agent in their own life. And that's a lot more powerful than someone who like spent 4 of the 5 minutes thinking of a situation and then they didn't really get to answer the question. So for this one, you spent too long like explaining what it was and you didn't quite get the main points across there. That's one thing. And the other thing is that the second one you did answer, but the third one you didn't quite answer. So this is another one of those where it's going like more general and going beyond the problem. So if you want to use like I guess you could say like writing out your knowns and the process, that would be a general strategy. It's usually good to have more than one as well. So like another problem solving strategy could be like taking a break from the problem and revisiting it later. It could be like if it's something where it's a scientific problem, going back to your source material, rereading the textbook, reviewing your own notes. Maybe you'll realize you forgot something. Or even like asking your friends, your lab mates, your supervisor, whoever can help you. Being someone who's able to recognize when they need help and being able to request that help when they do, that's actually a really important skill, because medicine is one of the most collaborative professions that there is. So being able to like not like rely on other people, but seek help when you need it, that's an important skill to have. Okay, let's try this one. Okay, my first thought is you've said the mother should have autonomy over the health decisions of the baby. That's kind of like when you're specifically assuming that it's a mother, you're kind of ignoring the other styles of families that there could be. And I don't know how nitpicky they are on that, but if I was the one who was marking this, that would immediately like turn me away from giving your answer a good mark. Like um you could say the parents should have, but also like what about the baby themselves? Like circumcisions can cause problems. I don't know if you know about this case, but there were these twins born and both of them got circumcised and they messed up the circumcision on one of them, and it ended up being that he had to get a complete sex change surgery. And then when he was like 20, he realized that he had actually been born a male and he got a second sex change. So having two sex changes in your life has a lot of negative implications. And then he had to go through his whole life like being trans, and there's a lot of stigma associated with that. So it just made his whole life more difficult than it would have been otherwise. So he had this procedure done to him that he didn't consent about, and the end of that story was that he ended up committing suicide at age 30. So it's a really sad story, specifically about the circumcision. Like if you know it, you can include it, but you're certainly not expected to know specific situations like that. Just this point about the mother or the parent having autonomy, like the baby itself, even though it can't currently consent, is also a consideration. So I would shy away from that point specifically. This second point is a really good one though. It shows that like you're aware of, like anytime there's any kind of medical procedure, it's the exact same thing as in the abortion debate, right? They say illegalize abortion, and then all that happens is that non-medical professionals perform an abortion. So it's probably going to be a similar thing with circumcision or any other procedure. If someone really wants it, they're going to find a way to have it done. And that way just might be less safe than it was legal. Definitely important to say you would do research. This is one of those situations where, like, again, the question is a trap because it's asking you if you would sign the petition, but you can't decide to sign the petition with the amount of information that's been given in the video. You have to go and fact check everything and make your own decision based on that additional investigation. So it's really good that you've said performing further research. It would be a pretty big red flag if you just answered yes or no outright. And then for this one, you did answer it up here. Autonomy of the family is a good point. And then restating this point here, like if they don't refer to someone who will do it safely, the family may end up still getting it done in a less safe setting. And then another point to make is that doctors have to realize that they can't be the decision maker for the patient. Like if you're someone who doesn't believe in circumcisions and because of that you refuse to refer your patient, you're kind of making that decision for them, the decision about like, do they get a circumcision? So I guess that's like coming back to the autonomy point, but if you just explain it in more depth, it'll show more that like you fully understand what autonomy is rather than just using it as a buzzword, because autonomy is one of those buzzwords. Like those from doing right, autonomy, maleficence, and beneficence, and whatever they have. If you're using any of the words from there, because so many people have read doing right and so many people use it, those are definitely things that you have to explain. Otherwise, your answer is just going to look exactly like all the other answers, and you're not going to be able to get an above average mark. Did you want to try answering the third question?
Sure. So I think I'd say that I explained the benefits and the risks to circumcision. And let the parents make their own choice in this case. And that if I was not willing to do it, I'd refer it to another physician.
Yeah, so that's basically all the points that there are for this question. So it comes back to like, what is your role as a pediatrician? So exactly what you said, your role as a pediatrician is to educate, but not to decide for the patient. So like, I wouldn't really add anything. That's a perfect answer. If only you'd had time to write it. Okay, let's try this one. So this is a really strong answer. Yeah, this is definitely your strongest like video-based answer. You've gotten most of the points. The only thing is that like again, organizing it into pros and against would have made it a little bit clearer. And then an additional perspective you could have said is that when this person is saying that they're just doing it to make up for their lack of privilege, like maybe you would explore exactly what they mean by that. So maybe they're in university on scholarship, and if they don't have that scholarship, they won't be able to pay for getting an education. So maybe that's what's influencing them to make this decision, because they don't really have another way to keep the scholarship. Or like it might not even be specifically a scholarship, but again, it comes back to that having empathy for a vulnerable party. So vulnerable party in CASPer means like the person who's done something wrong, basically. Every time you see someone's done something unethical, just make as many excuses for them as you can, just because a lot of the time there are these outside factors, like exactly what you've said here. The the last thing, this point where you've made here, out of fairness to the other students, if they aren't caught and finish the course, they should be reported to the academic administrator. One thing is to mention what the impact on your friend would be. Like this is something that could end their entire career if they're reported. And making this decision without considering that perspective is a pretty big problem. So you definitely have to consider like what'll happen to them if they now have this academic dishonesty thing on their transcript. And the other thing is that anytime someone has done something wrong and you have to turn them in, the most important thing is to first give them an opportunity to turn themselves in. So in this case, if you go to your friend and you like help them understand why it's wrong and you give them that opportunity to turn themselves in, first of all, they're going to receive a more lenient punishment, or potentially even like no punishment. And they also have this opportunity to like clear their conscience and make it right. And that's something that can be incredibly empowering. So showing that even though this person has still done something right, you still care about like giving them that opportunity to correct it, that's so important as well. I guess like you just ran out of time, so you didn't have, I'm sure you would have said these things if you had more time for this question. So this is another one where I think you ran out of time, so you started missing points in the later questions, but you had a really strong start. So what you say to your two employees, you could even like write out in quotation marks exactly what you would say, because one important thing is that, like what you've said here, you can't ignore the worries of the others. You have to make your employees feel validated. That is part of your role as the boss, is to like help create a safe, or like not even safe, like positive work environment for your employees. And if they feel like their concerns are just being ignored, then that's going to be a negative workplace. So that's the main point for this one. And then this part here, like questioning the question, that's important as well. And then this is like a bonus point. Not a lot of people are going to say that, so it'll make your answer stand out when you do. It shows that like you really understood the implications of what drinking is. Like Albert has stayed home potentially because he's drunk, but it's better to stay home if you're drunk than to show up to your job as a delivery employee and then like be drinking and driving as part of your job. So that'll definitely be part of it. And then the impact on the business for sure. So the first part is pretty strong. Oh, and then asking them not to talk about this. Yeah, that's a really important point as well. Just the way it was organized, I almost missed it. But like keeping the confidentiality and privacy of all of your employees is so important, and not encouraging them to spread gossip. That's a really good point as well. And then for this last part, like being more specific about how you would approach him, especially since it's a specific question that they've asked here. When they're saying how would you approach them, they're really looking forward to seeing like a really respectful approach. Like you would take him somewhere that he's comfortable and somewhere that's private, so that there aren't like people listening into this conversation, and then starting off with small talk to make it less awkward, and also coming from a place of trying to support him rather than getting straight into the late deliveries. It's kind of similar to the other one with the friend who had stolen money. Like the exact same way that you would approach that friend should be your approach for how you deal with Albert. There's going to be at least one question on the CASPer where you have to explain how you would confront someone who's done something wrong. So having that like approach nailed down is really going to save you time. So the main points are like somewhere that's private and comfortable for them, and like starting off with small talk, and then also coming from a perspective of trying to support them rather than accusing them. Those are the three important things to say when they ask you about your approach for someone who's done something wrong. Okay, for this third one, do you want to try rephrasing it? Like, what do you mean by issues with the deliveries you could help with?
So I think I meant like, because he wasn't getting his deliveries done. So what are some ways that like I could support him in his work so that he can actually achieve his goals?
Okay, yeah, that's a lot better a way to phrase it than what you had written. So just say exactly that, pretty much. It's like hard when you're actually trying to answer it and the clock is ticking down. The safety of the people on the road outweighs his feelings. Like I get what you're trying to say with that, but that's something that's like important to consider. Like even every time you're making a comparison against two things and calling one more important, you're just creating an unnecessary risk. But when you create bullet points and be like pros and cons and not treating one as more important, you're still getting all the perspectives down. I don't think they really give marks for being able to rank the perspectives because it depends on so many things. Like what if he's not, like if he's your boss, he might not be a delivery worker, so he might not be in a situation where he's making people unsafe. It could just be that like he's producing low quality work. Or you could even call it like not his feelings. Like you could still approach him in a way that doesn't hurt his feelings if you're really sensitive about it. or if you feel uncomfortable approaching him, if you feel like you would get in trouble approaching him because he's your boss, you can go about it another way, like a anonymous way, or getting someone else involved. You did manage to avoid the main trap with this question. A lot of people, when it switches from being your employee to your boss or anything like that, what ends up happening is they'll say like, oh, if it's my boss, then it's not my position to approach him. When in fact, if it's a problem for the employee, then it's also a problem for the boss. So having like a completely different approach depending on what your status is, then like that's a red flag. So it's really good that you managed to avoid that. And the other point for this question is like, always you can refer to resources, so helping him overcome it. And the other thing is that if the, like you want to empower whichever one it is, your employee or your boss, you want to empower them to seek the solution on their own. So when you say like, I'll help you achieve it, but at the end of the day, it's going to be on you to solve this issue, then that goes back to the same point of like giving them the opportunity to make it right. So what I mean by that is like helping them find the resources, but then it's up to them to go through with the whole plan of like overcoming the alcoholism, if that is what it is, on their own. And then you mentioned up here, these claims have not yet been proven. And then when you go to your approach to Albert, you could say that when you start, you wouldn't, like, again, exactly what you said, the claims have not been proven. So you can't assume that he really has these drinking problems. When you approach Albert, part of what you would want to do is confirm the claims before you start following up on it. Even before you approach Albert, like you could say the first thing I would do is check if it's even Albert who's supposed to be doing this delivery, just in case the problem is something else, if there's like some kind of breakdown in the communication. Okay, let's try this one. Okay, so this is like another star situation. You did do star, but you missed the L in terms of like, I guess you did mention what you did, like you made a list of mistakes and then like keeping a mistake diary. If you could like even add that half sentence to there, like now I keep a mistake diary anytime there's something that like you could benefit from doing something like that, then that would be a better point, because you want it to be that every time a situation happens, you get this general lesson that you can apply to multiple different contexts. And then I guess you already know what I'm going to say for this question, like don't take an example from academics. So I'm not going to belabor that point. Okay, so for this one, you kind of answered the third question more so than the second. So these two are going to come up either in the CASPer or in your MMIs. So it's definitely worth spending the time to think of a really strong answer for these. So like you see in this question, and the other ones, they like give you 3 questions and then they're like 3 less heavy questions. And the reason that this one has these 3 heavy questions is because all 3 of these are something that you should have prepared beforehand. For all 3 of these, the expectation is that you just come in and start typing, right? Like this is a real risk for every applicant. Only 10% of people are not accepted. So everyone should have a plan of what happens if not. And for this one as well, like they're not looking for the medicine or die crowd. They are looking for people that have some kind of backup plan. So if you wanted to write more for here, what I did when I was asked this question, like I think I was asked it on like a practice CASPer or something, maybe it was MMI prep, but what you can do is split it into short term and long term. So like in the short term, I would take the time to feel upset and recognize my emotions. And then you can talk about like whatever strategies you have about de-stressing. just to show that you are resilient and you are able to deal with failure. Because if you can't deal with not getting accepted to medical school, how are you going to deal with having a patient die on you, right? So having these skills of being able to move past a failure is so important. So whatever de-stressing strategies you would do, if your de-stressing strategy has something to do with your extracurriculars, then that's extra bonus points. So for example, what I said was that I found dance to be de-stressful. So I would like spend time choreographing and performing a dance to get my mind off the application process temporarily, of course, before trying again. Then that's extra points because it shows like who are you outside of this medical school application process. And that's really what the goal of every question is, right? To have that opportunity for you to showcase your personality and who you are outside of medicine. And then what you do in the long term is like more of what you've written here of like reviewing your application, understanding what your weak areas are. If it's your GPA, then like improving it and so on. You don't really need to like if you had skipped this sentence, if I was unsuccessful, I would consider a different career. That's kind of not the place to say that. Like they do want people who are going to try again. If you just skip this question and put all the rest of this under here, you would have wasted less time typing and it would have even been a stronger answer. Like you don't need to like explain that you would ever quit on medicine. Just if they've specifically asked you, then of course you want to answer the question, but you don't need to like justify. Like it's clear that it's just for the purposes of this question. Otherwise, you're obviously going to be applying again. And then the approach for what would you do if you could not pursue medicine? You want to mention like why are you pursuing medicine in the first place? And you kind of have done that here, like you like medicine because it's science applied to helping others. So that's a good point. And then like even saying like teaching can be applied to generating future doctors. That's a clever point as well. I really like that. This sentence here is good. This last sentence here, I see that you're trying to justify why you would not go for teaching over top of like being a doctor, but that's just not the strongest point to say. Like you still need to be able to teach others effectively as a doctor. Medicine is such an academic field. You're not going to be able to get away with not having teaching skills. So that's not as good of a con. Something else you could say is that on the other hand, you wouldn't be able to deal with patients directly. So that's something that is pretty unique to actually being a doctor and that professors might not have. And then the other thing that you can do is like teaching is pretty broad. It's kind of implied that you would just be a university professor. And that's not really an answer that stands out. A lot of people are going to put being a university professor as their backup. Teaching is a good answer in general, but if you change it to something else, it could be even stronger. Like, for example, if you say like, I would specifically want to teach special ed students because I have this background in working with special ed students, so I already know it's something that I love and it's something that I could make a big difference in, then that's stronger because again, it shows like you have this opportunity to sneak in one of your extracurriculars. I know someone who got accepted to U of T, and what her answer was is that if she couldn't pursue medicine, she would be a wedding planner. And then you're like, what does being a wedding planner have to do with pursuing medicine? And what her rationale was is that she wanted to work directly with people and she wanted to like bring joy into their lives. And that's something that a wedding planner can definitely do. So you can relate literally anything to medicine. And then her reason for why she didn't want to be a wedding planner is because there isn't a lot of science involved and she also has this passion for science. So that's like the cheap way out. Like any career you pick outside of science, you can instantly say, but then I wouldn't be able to approach science. And then that's like a good answer because no one can fault you for loving science. It's not a red flag and it's not anything against that career, right? Like you also don't want to have a point that makes the other career seem less than. In general, I would stay away from saying like I would pursue research, being a university professor, or being a nurse, just because that's what the majority of people are going to say. So you want to be able to say something that would help you stand out a little bit more, and also something that like helps you showcase your extracurriculars. If you are someone who's like, of course I absolutely definitely want to do research and that's the only thing I've thought of, then you can put it if you're like truly that passionate about it. But if that's the case, then you probably have extracurriculars in research, so you could mention those as well, just to help strengthen your answer. Being a nurse is definitely one that I would stay away from. Like, it's kind of a red flag if you consider being a nurse as a backup plan to being a doctor, because those two fields are just like so different. You can't call one better or worse. You can't have one be the backup to the other one. So I would just stay away from mentioning that at all. Okay, so really strong answer for the first part. It's kind of the pattern with yours. You answer the first question really well, and then the second and third one, it starts to break down. Like, other than just saving time by using less complete sentences and like organizing it, stuff I've already mentioned, I don't have anything else to add for the first part. And then for the second part, again, like, this is another one where you're approaching someone who's done something wrong. So then the private, comfortable environment, starting off with small talk rather than directly getting into it, and coming from the perspective of trying to help him rather than accusing him. Those are the main things you to say. You have hit most of those. It just could be organized a little bit better. And then for the third point, like, you didn't fully get to answer that at all. So I understand why you're saying your answer would not change if it was a physician, because like the problem is still the same about how like the hand sanitizer is constantly finished, and focusing on the facts is definitely an important thing to say. But one thing to consider is how the role of a physician is different from the role of a random person whose job you might not know. The physician is responsible for people's lives. So one thing you can do is consider how the patients would react. So if the patients see a random person consuming hand sanitizer, like, imagine how you would feel. You're in the emergency room, you've got your broken arm, and there's this random person drinking the hand sanitizer. Like, if that was me, I would feel really unsafe. And then let's say if I noticed that instead of directly addressing the problem, they just move the hand sanitizer, how would that impact your perception of the hospital? So that's another perspective that is kind of reusable, considering like what the media implications would be, what people would think if this got out, or like what would happen if everyone made this decision. Those are like kind of both the same thing. So mentioning that like moving it is not very good for how the patients would feel. You want the patients to feel safe. And then that comes back to the physician, because let's say you're a patient, you've got a broken arm, and then the doctor comes to see you, and then after he sees you, he goes and drinks some hand sanitizer. Like, that's not really ideal for you as a patient. So your answer would change if it was a physician, because it's so much worse if a physician is consuming hand sanitizer than if this random person is. And what your role is, so it doesn't exactly say what your job is, but you're somebody who works at a hospital. So you can assume your role is something along the lines of promoting patient health, like just something that has something to do with that. So if you're seeing this physician consuming hand sanitizer, that's not really good for patient health. So what you need to do is like make sure the problem gets resolved so that you aren't putting patient health at risk. If you fail to address it and it's a physician, you're like kind of letting down your patients, versus if it's a random person and you don't address it, like, you should of course still address it, but it's just less bad. So for when it's just a person, you can talk to him and refer him to resources. But if it's a physician, then you have to let him know that, like, unless he solves this problem, you're going to have to report him to administration, and that could have negative implications for his career. Like for the physician, basically what I'm trying to say is you have to make sure the problem gets resolved. And then for the man, like, of course, you're going to try your best to do it, but you're not like going to escalate it to his boss. You might not even know who his boss is, or he might not have one. So like, it's kind of different when you get to the physician. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so in the case where it's changing the person, but the status doesn't change, then your answer shouldn't change. But if it's a physician, then it should.
Yeah, not just a physician, anyone who has responsibility for other people. Like if it was a police officer, it'd be the same thing. Because like if this police officer is consuming hand sanitizer, like why are they doing that? Are there mental health risks? And like people have a lot of responsibility when other people's life or freedom or anything else is at stake.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, we're almost done. Yeah, so this is a really strong answer in terms of the second half, actually. Usually it's the first half. You kind of spent like, you spent too much time and at the same time too little time explaining what the situation is. Like, I don't know what this research project is for. If you mention that like it's for your extracurriculars, just to like make it clear what else you have in your life, then that would be stronger. And then you explained what the issue is, so that's good. And then also like making excuses for what the person is. You don't know the reasons for the behavior. You could have expanded even more on that to say like you don't know what else they have going on in their life, what additional stressors, what else they're facing, or even like being more specific with that. That could be beneficial. Even if you said like you did approach this person and you realized like whatever it was, like just as an example, maybe their mother had passed away recently and that's why they were like having these behavioral issues, and then that just goes to show, to like prove your point of how they're not doing it maliciously. And then the thing you change is that you would just approach them earlier and check in with everyone earlier. So it's like a very subtle difference. Overall, it's a pretty strong answer. And then also like acknowledging how it's not fair for the rest of the team to do extra work. I see a lot of people being like, so therefore I just did the whole project, and in the future I planned as if I would have to do the entire project rather than relying on my group members. Like this is way stronger than that answer. The other answer is even like a red flag, because you collaboration is such an important skill, and then by saying that I just plan to do everything on my own, you're showing that you're not able to collaborate. Versus here, you show that not only are you a collaborator, but you're a leader, and you're giving this opportunity for like giving support to other people, but also in a respectful manner, and that's very important. Then you answered the other two like within here, so fine that you left them blank. All right, let's try this one. So you hit most of the points with this question. Definitely you should not take the picture, as you said, because of consent, and then not making assumptions. An additional point you could make is that you don't know what the specifics of Daisy and George's relationship is. Like maybe they have an open relationship and George is also like seeing other women and that's just how they like it. And then like you meddling with this is just gonna negatively impact your relationship with Daisy and George. So like acknowledging that relationships, families, so on can come in different shapes and sizes. It's like with that earlier question about the research conference, where you mentioned that it depends on if Sarah is closer to her mom or her aunt, and not assuming that she's automatically closer to her mom. it's kind of the same point here. Like, you don't know the specifics of people's lives. So like acknowledging that families come in different shapes and sizes is so important. And then if George specifically asked, you'd be honest. You could just say that you think he should talk to Daisy about this. You don't have to like say yes or no. So like the thing I kind of base this off of is that when you're working in a family med clinic, a lot of the times your patient's family will call you and be like, how is my, like, let's say they're calling about their mom, they'll be like, how's my mom doing? Did you prescribe her anything new? And you actually can't even confirm that this person is a patient of yours. So it's kind of the same approach that you would have here. Like, you shouldn't answer yes or no, especially since you don't know exactly what is going on here. Like, what if this is just someone who she's really good friends with? Like it was, or like her father that she hadn't seen in a while. So that's why she's like hugging him. Or maybe like it's even George that you saw and he just had a new haircut, so you didn't recognize him. Like, you don't know for sure that she's cheating. So like telling George that you've seen this could be misleading, right? So since you don't have any confirmation, leaving it out isn't quite a lie by omission. Like, unless you're 100% sure that she's cheating. And then the other thing is, again, like when there's someone who's done something wrong, giving them that opportunity to correct it themselves. Like, think about the future of Daisy and George's relationship. If you're interfering here and like you're the one who goes to George and says how this is, that could completely destroy their relationship. Versus if you give Daisy the opportunity to make things right and confess and like explain why it happened and what she's going to do differently, then that can really empower Daisy and it can help her to like not have that weighing on her conscience. And then at the same time, it would probably be better for George as well, because like it's adding insult to injury, because then not only did Daisy cheat on him, she also like lied and tried to keep it a secret. Versus if she confesses, then it's like only one thing that she's done. Does that make sense for you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so that's it for all the questions. I'm gonna stop the recording now. How do you stop recording?